Wait, hello? Hello? Can everyone hear me? All right. I guess I'm gonna try to clip it again and see. Can you hear me or no? Okay, sounds good. All right. So let's get started with week 4 for the Ruby on. Oh, I don't have it up on the screen. Just give me a second. So yeah, we're 1 month into the course, and today, pretty much, we're going to be learning how to. So within the last 3 weeks, we've learned how to route to pages and how to store data. What we're going to learn today is how to route to a page and use a form to enter in data and have that data be stored into our database, and us being able to retrieve information back from that database. Just some logistical stuff. How many of you saw the Piazza email blast? Okay. And about how many of you actually signed into the website within the last few days? Okay. So that's most of you that showed up today. If you haven't, you should do that as soon as possible. And here's the reason why. So I actually really messed up on Monday. Like, in my 6th year, not 6th year, I mean 6 semesters of managing production databases, 4 semesters of teaching this course, I've never once accidentally done something wrong with the database yet until Monday, where I actually dropped all the data, which pretty much means I kind of deleted. If you don't know much about databases, it's the same thing as, let's say you're working, like you have an Excel sheet, right, of all your students. It's our only single copy, and I have information that of students and their grades from like several semesters, bunch of accounts, and what I did was I just deleted the file. I had no backup. I deleted the file, and it was just a brain slip. I've learned my lesson, and basically what I could show you later is how to make backups of your database, which I learned after Monday. But so the thing is, I didn't have a backup. Usually on some other applications I work with, I usually have backups, but for the Rails Decal, I didn't. So basically, what important information was lost? Basically, the check-in information was lost for the first 2 weeks. So if you didn't show up and you decide to start showing up to class now, you got lucky because it's kind of free pass. For your home, you all do your homework assignments and host it on GitHub, and your GitHub's commits have a date on it. So none of your homework, like none of your work, your actual work was lost. But we submit our grades to your assignments on through the website. Has anyone actually looked at any of their grades before? Okay, perfect. Because well, not perfect, but we actually graded your first homework assignment, but all that was lost. So today was normally supposed to announce, oh yeah, you can go in, check your grade for your first assignment, and here's how to do it, but that's all gone. So sorry, we're now backlogged on homeworks, but hopefully we'll get through that really quickly. And the reason I wanted everybody to sign into the website was after when you sign into the website, I could then, after all the students who are in this class sign into the website, I could just wait to make one method call to just loop through everybody and make sure they all have the ability to submit assignments. And I will do that later tonight after everybody signs in. So if you have not signed in yet, sign in now, and I'll add the ability to resubmit assignments. And what that means is you also have, I re-put up the first 2 assignments, and you could just resubmit the links there. And if you're done with the 3rd homework, that is, then you could submit it between now and Normally it was due this Friday, but I've extended it to Sunday because of this whole little screw up I did. And homework 4 is also out in case you want to start early, and it's not due this Friday, but the Friday afterwards. Yes, question. Yeah, you don't need to apply, just sign in, and then after you sign in, your user count is in our system, and I could just easily just go for a loop through all the users and add the ability for everyone who's currently in this course to submit assignments. Do I have any more questions about? Yes?
So we have to resubmit everything?
Yeah, but it shouldn't be too hard. It's just two links. Yeah. Any more? All right. Yeah, so that's what happened. Hopefully it's not too inconvenient to submit those 2 links, but that will not happen again. I'm about 99.99% sure. Yeah. The slides are not on Piazza right now. I could just, I'll just put it up right now, actually. It's pretty easy. What I'm gonna do is copy this link, post, create the post, slides 4, and also most of my live coding is going to be actually going to be within the homework assignment that that is being released today. So I'll also link that in the Piazza right now by insert link. Go. Actually, repository right here. And if you want to go to homework 4 and just look at it, it will have like something close to the final version of the live coding I will be doing today, or you could start from scratch and just follow along. All right, so that should be updated. And yeah, okay. So continuing on the actual lecture, today there's only going to be about like 3 or 4 slides, and the reason why is these are more reference slides. I'm just to do this process of creating a form for you to enter information, and that form, submitting the form stores information, is actually a composition of things you've learned within the last 2 weeks, but they're completely, it seems completely disjoint right now, but then you actually have about, well, you have about like 90% of the information of how to do that. Just important methods to kind of explain, or sorry, before that. So just to talk about overall web architecture and stuff like that. A common term you'll see a lot is CRUD, C-U-R-D, and that's just an acronym for create, read, update, and destroy, which are basically actions that you perform on a resource. And when I say a resource, that's like for the purpose of this class, think about a resource as just like a model or a single table that we have. So like a user can be a resource, a dog can be a resource, and actions that are commonly performed on these resources are either creating them, reading them. Well, so create is basically, I don't have, like, if we're talking about users specifically, we just insert a new user into our database. When we talk about reading, we're talking about, okay, just give me more information about this user. When we talk about updating, we're saying, oh, I have a user that exists. I want to change information about that particular user. And finally, destroy is saying, oh, I just want to take this user information away from my table and never have it appear again. And that's what I did to all of you guys on Monday, unfortunately. Within Rails controllers, right? You remember that controllers are basically what responds to a request. Every time I issue a request from a browser, my router will look at the string, look at the request, look at the URL, the data that's sent with it, and send it to a particular controller and a particular action on that controller. Common actions that we have in Rails are index, which means generally this will be a list of all the all the resources, or at least multiple of the same resources. We have a show, which is generally a detailed view of a particular resource. We have new, which is basically saying like a form to create a new resource. And finally, we have create, which is the endpoint where your new form hits to actually create the resource. And the most important distinction I want to make right now that people usually get confused about is the difference between new and create. New means when you get a new, sorry, let me step back. Usually you make a GET request for a new, and the reason is new is simply a form. You don't save anything when you make a request to new. You're just saying, give me just a form where I can fill in my name, phone number, email, and all that stuff. So when you get this form back, like when you sign up for Facebook or when you go to sign up form, they don't automatically insert a new empty user in their database for you. They wait until you send them the minimal amount of information they need to create a user before actually creating a user. And what new is getting that form. What create is where that is where the information gets sent to actually insert the user. So I'm on Facebook, I'm trying to sign up for an account. I enter my name, email, phone number. I don't know what else you enter there, but I fill out that information. And when I click submit, it will bundle all that data and send it in a request to my create endpoint. And when my create endpoint receives that piece of data, it's gonna parse through it, look at my name, my email, run some logic, and insert it into my database. Do I have any questions so far about the different? Yes.
You mean that each one of these will be different page?
So for the purpose of our basic Rails app that we're going to be using within the next few weeks, yes, these will be different views and different actions. But when we get into more, I don't want to say more real, but just like web applications, you see that some of these views are actually like put together. But for the sake of learning them as like independent actions, I will keep them separate for now. And Rails provides extra tools for this kind of format. Any more questions? All right, cool. So another topic we'll cover is resourcing routes. And that is basically combining multiple routes into one. And what I mean by that is normally in our routes file, we've seen that we've created an individual route for every request. For example, I would say get, to match one GET request, I write a GET line, and to match a POST request, I write another line. What resources allows us to do is basically write several of those lines, but only with one. And this, I'm just talking about like this vague general thing right now, but when I go into the live coding, I'll show what this concretely means. Another topic that we'll get into that you haven't learned yet is strong parameters. And what strong parameters are is basically saying that when you make a request, normally when you make a request on Facebook to the Facebook server to create an account, you do it through the form, right? You fill out your name, email, phone number on the form, and they'll tell you like the minimal amount of information that they want from the user. But let's say that I have a malicious user, not a malicious user, a malicious attacker. And that attacker wants to not just write my name, my email, and my phone number, but let's say also wants let's say an attacker wants to overwrite something like a Boolean on the user that says that they're an admin. You don't want them to have the ability to do that because, I could actually send a request to any URL just through my terminal, and I could just fill it with any data I want. It's kind of hard, like it's not super hard, but it's just like I have to type a lot, but I still have the ability to do that. And what strong parameters allows you to do is anytime you make a request to kind of insert information or update information, that our Rails application can filter out the information that we want and make sure that this information is safe for our functionality. Okay. And finally, we will see a method within our views called form4. And what form4 does is it takes in a model and it will basically create a form for you. Or it will create, it'll make creating a form much more easily. And how it will do it is it will basically infer where to send a request when the form is submitted. So when you submit a form, it goes to a particular URL. What form4 allows you to do is create a form and instead of you specifying, like, I want you to send this post request to this certain URL, it'll do a lot of guessing for you where you have to write less code. And as long as you follow proper Rails format, that you don't have to like manually write out a really long URL. And it could pre-populate your forms as well. Okay. Paths is something we talked about on week 2, and it's basically whenever I define a route, like if I define a route called get lions, it will define a lions path for me, and I could use that within my code to refer to wherever that path leads, and it's going to show up in the live coding example. Okay, so I've just talked about a lot of stuff, and hopefully I will address all those things in a more concrete example in my live coding session. Do you have any questions before I begin? Okay, so I'm actually going to start from scratch again, and I know I do this a billion times, but I feel like just repeating myself, even though like you've heard it a billion times, it just makes it more memorable. So I'm going to say, to start a new Rails application, I do Rails new, and I'm going to call this lecture 4. And it'll create a new Rails application for me called lecture 4. Creates all these files, runs bundle install, which says, give me all my dependencies, and it should be ready. So I go to my lecture 4 folder. I run, okay, I want to also close out some tabs. Okay, I'm going to run Rails S, which stands for Rails server, which starts up my Rails application. And another thing I'm going to do is open up my text editor on my application. So now my basic Rails application. Now I think to myself, okay, what I want to do is have my Rails application store users. Does anyone remember off the top of their head, how do I create a user? Or how would I create a user, both the model and the database, and make it store 2 things? Right now it's name and email. Exactly. So if you remember from last week, we have Rails generators. I'm going to try to make that bigger. Let's see. I'll just overflow to the next line. Okay, so I could do Rails G for Rails generate model to tell them what I want to generate, and I'm going to pass in the name of the model and then attributes about the model. I'm going to say it has a name, which is a string, and an email, which is a string. Press enter, and bam, it creates both the migration for creating a user or adding a user table into my database, and creates the user model, which is what my Ruby application can actually access. So how do I actually apply my migration files? Exactly. So to apply my migrations, I could just run rake db migrate, bam, and now I have access to users. Like if I go to Rails C, which is my Rails console, and say u equals user.new, I have an empty user with a name field and an email field. And right now, from what we learned from last week, we could just say the user's name is me, Howard Chen, and my u.email, let's just say is howard@howard.com. And right now, this instance of a user model lives in my memory, but it doesn't live in my database. So to store in the database, what I have to do is call save on it. And it'll give me the SQL transaction string that says, okay, I've actually inserted Howard into my table. And since it returned true, it means this insertion was successful. Okay. What we also did last week towards the end was create I'm actually going to insert another user really quickly. And if you remember, another way to insert users is just do create. So what create does is it calls new and then calls .save right after. And instead of doing it step by step, I'm just going to pass in an attribute params, which is just basically options that are my attributes. So I'm just going to say its name is Rob, and this person's email is bob@c.com. And now when I do user.count, this will just give me the number of users. I should have 2 users. This is all from last week. Okay, and the thing we did towards the last week was we created an index view that showed us all the users in our database. And I could either start from creating the controller and then the route, or what I did last week was actually use the generator. So I'm just going to do Rails G controller, which allows Rails to generate a controller for me. I'm going to say it is going to be a user's controller. So an important thing, I'm not sure if I mentioned this yet, is that if you want a controller to be that is tied to a model to exist, the name of the controller should be pluralized. So I'm going to call it a user's controller. And the method I had from last week on it was index, which says, show me all the users on my in my database. So I'm going to run this generator. Important things are that it created within apps / controllers a users _ controller with an index method. And within the views, it created a users folder. And within that users folder, it created an index.html.erb. And if you remember from the second week that if I go to my routes file, this was also a route was also generated to a route was also generated when I use my Rails generator. But I'm gonna say that instead of going to users / index, I'm gonna say if I send a GET request to /users. Oh yes, sorry. Oh okay, wait, could you? Okay. We good? Okay, so when I make a GET request to users, I'm going to map it to the name of my controller, which is my user's controller, put a hash tag on it, and then put the name of the action, index. And if you look here, right now my index doesn't run any logic. And with my index.html.erb, it'll just say users #index, find me in this folder. And then when I go to localhost 3000 /users, it'll give me that page. And what we did at the end of last week was, within our controller, we accessed all the users in our database. So we did user.all, which is a query that says, find me all the users, give me all the attributes, right? And what we did was we assigned it to an variable, an instance variable. And the special thing about instance variables is that views can only access instance variables. So when I define @users in my index action, my index.html.erb has the ability to access @users. So I'm going to rename the header of this page to all users in my DB. Let's go to database. And then I wrote some embedded Ruby, which if you remember is just Ruby logic inside my view. I'm going to say @users. And to do embedded Ruby, I have to put a %. but I'm going to say at users, which references the users in my controller. I'm going to do dot each do user. And if we remember from our Ruby lecture that when we do an array dot each do, and we pass in basically a variable to be used in the loop, I'm going to say whatever in this loop is for each individual element of this user's array, run this logic. I'm going to say print out. If you remember, the equal sign says print out this Ruby evaluation into the code. I'm going to say the name of the user, print it out. I'm going to put it in a p tag, which is a paragraph tag in HTML. Okay, and with all Ruby clauses, what I want to do is end it. So in my index.html.erb, I'll access whatever at users was in my users controller's index action. And for each of the individual users, I'm just going to put in a p tag the user's name. And bam. So if I just make this bigger, I'd say all users in my database, which is me, Howard Chan, and the second user, Rob. And we've actually learned all those things within like the last 2 weeks, last 3 weeks. So at this point, we have the ability to store information, but the only way we could store it is through our console. And we have a way to gather all this information and show it on our web page. What we're going to do now is have the ability for someone purely through these, purely through front end, purely through forms, insert information into our database. Okay. Do you have any questions about, I know I just went through like a lot of things because basically I just kind of breezed over what we did over the last 3 weeks. Do you have any questions before we continue about anything that I said that we kind of went over but you actually don't understand or anything like that? All right. Yeah.
When you generate a controller, Rails automatically create a route.
Yeah.
Does that route works?
Oh, the route works. The old route, to get to the page, the one that was generated, I would have to go to /users/index, but I don't want to use that route, and I'll talk about why a little bit later, because yeah, I don't like for the purpose of using index, I actually don't want a /index, just to keep my routes cleaner. Let's just say that for now. Okay. So in my lecture slides, I was talking about basically let's insert a user through a form. Now I want to create that form. Does anyone remember the action I was that I talked about in my slides that says get me a form to create something? That's a specific method in the view to create a form. But if you remember, I was talking about like index of something. I talked about create. I talked about show, and the thing I was looking for was actually new. So right now, I'm going to define a method on my controller called new. And what it's going to do is give me a form to create a new user. Okay, so first I want to create a route for this. Since this form is only doesn't update any information right now, right? To retrieve this form, I don't have to update any information, don't have to change anything. I'm going to say this is going to be a GET request. If someone makes a GET request to /users/new. What I'm going to do is route it to the users new method or new action, which I defined here. It doesn't do anything right now. So I've created a route for someone to go to user/new, and what I should get is a form. But instead of a form, I'm just going to do an empty page for now to start off with the basics. So since I want this HTML page to render when I go to new, I should just match the name of the method and say new.html.erb and have that. And I'm just going to create a header and say create a new user. And I'm going to close the header. So right now, if I go to user/new, I have an empty page to create a new user. So normally when you create a form, in HTML, you would do something like input, blah, 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 form, and you'd have to tell it the form which URL to go to when you submit it. What Rails provides you is an easy way to create forms. And there's a method in Rails called form_for, the views. And what you have to pass it is a model, an instance of a model. But right now, we do not have an instance of a model. So what I'm going to do in the controller is provide myself an instance of a model for my view to use. So I'm going to say @user equals user.new. This user is empty, but it is still an instance of a user. So I'm going to pass into my form for @user right here. And what I'm going to do now is define fields on my form. So, oh, and I forgot something. In the syntax, you have to do form_for @user do f. And now in this code block, f refers to my form. My form will have a method called f.text_input. And it will refer to the user's name. I copy that, make sure it shows up. Have another input for the user's username. And finally, I'm going to make sure I close it, but I forgot one final thing, and it is a f.submit.
Does these values have to be the same as the
No,
columns?
it does not have to be the same for the columns. It does not, but there's a reason why you want them to be the same as the columns.
In our users, I think there's name.
Oh, yeah, okay, you're right. Thanks for catching that. You could still, this form should still work even though I didn't put correctly the email, but when I make the request, it would have given me a wrong key value pairings, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so when I go to user/new, I should error, but that's not the error I was looking for. Text input. Oh, is it text field? Field. Okay. Now I have this form, but if I do stuff and create users, I have a routing error. And the reason is this form, okay, I got a little ahead of myself, sorry. So this form_for is a method in Rails views that creates HTML for me. And if you inspect element, you can see the output of the HTML output here. And what it did was that method constructed all of this. It gave it these inputs, gave it like an auth token, because if you take 160, wait, is anyone in 161 right now? Okay, for those who are in 161, if you remember talking about CSRF tokens, this is actually the CSFR token right here, which basically says that for those, this is specifically those in 161. It basically says that when I submit this form, it'll tell the Rails server it actually came from a form rather than someone injecting a request that I clicked on. And if you don't understand that because you're not 161, that's totally fine. It's not important for this class. Okay, so it generates all these inputs. And what's important is it also says that when I submit this form, I want to submit it to the /users endpoint. Never once did I, oh crap. I'm recording my face the whole time instead of the screen. Yep, that's not good. I could re-record the first half of the lecture. It's totally fine. You're all supposed to be here all the time anyways, but I could re-record the first half, or I could just do a whole re-recording. It makes it easier. But and as I said earlier, that on the homework assignment is going to be generally about this final code, except it's annotated. So I left comments about what every line does. And if you do the homework looking at the annotated code, like I gave you an annotation and I gave you an assignment, if you look at the annotated code, it'll make the homework kind of ridiculously easy. So what I would recommend doing for the homework is trying to do it without it. And when you get stuck, just look at the relative corresponding thing. This hint will make more sense when you start looking at the homework, if you have not already. But okay, continuing on. This form 4 created me a form right here, and it sends, when I submit this form, it'll go to /users. How did it know to go to /users? I've never once told it that there's a URL called /users. So here's a bunch of Rails sorcery that's happening. The reason Rails knows to go to the /users path is due to the fact that what I pass into form 4 was an instance of a model. And what form 4 will do is inspect the instance of a model, find out its class name, and pluralize it. And that's how it actually generates a route. So Rails is going to make this assumption that you have created a /users route, and automatically you could manually override it. If you pass in options to this method, you could say, actually make this request go to /ABCDEFG. But what Rails will do is just assume that you're going to follow Rails convention and make it route to that path. Unfortunately, we don't have that path. So when we click on the form, it'll just kind of splatter all over the place. But for now, we have this form. And I can enter in this form names like hi, email like bye. And when I click this, it would naturally send a request, but my server would error because there's no way to match it. Yeah.
Shouldn't it be user /create instead of?
So basically, it is one of those style things, right? And Rails has a certain way they want you to style things. And basically, a certain route /users, right? Right now we create a /get users to get the index of the users. But what Rails will assume is that you'll overload the /users route. So that when you do a get to /users, you want an index of the users. But when you do a post, like when you tell the server to create and insert this resource, that that you'll also go to /users. It's just a stylistic thing Rails wants you to do. And if you keep to this style, Rails will allow you to write less lines of code to do the same thing. So let's see, can you even see anything? Okay, no, but here is what we're gonna do next. So now I've created this form, right? I've entered this information in this form. I click on it, it sends a request. What I could do now is create a route. That route, the form says it doesn't exist, but I'm gonna create a route to make it exist. Let's say if you make a post request to users, what I'm going to do is send it to users controllers, create action. I'm not defined to create action yet, but I'm about to. And from what I said during the lecture slides, it's that a create, it actually receives the input of the form and actually makes the insertion to the database. So I'm going to go into my controller, define myself my create action. But instead of doing any insertions, what I'm going to do right now is redirect to index. Just show you that the route exists, and if I submit this, I'm just going to redirect it to the index. I'm not doing the actual insertion, but I just want to show you after you create the route. Put in Howard, so my email h@h.com. Hit create user. Oh, okay, no data received. Why is that? Boop, boop, boop. Oh, it should have been action index. That's not important. The important thing I want you to look at is my server log. So before, in your second homework assignment, what you did was we actually made the form for you, and you put in information in the form like an adjective, a name and an adjective, and you submitted the form. And if you remember, you access the information from that form submission through your params. And to look at your parameters, when you look at a request, you see that when I click submit on the form, I made a post request to /users, which is what we intended. It's going to get processed by my users controllers create action, because that's what my route said. If I got a post request to /users, send it to the users controllers create action. Oh, excuse me. The important part to look at here is the parameters. That every time I make a request, I send in data with it. And right here, towards this line, you see this. I have a key value pair, right? The key is user, and the value is another hash map. And within the hash map are the names of my attributes, which one is name, and what I put into that field. Like, for example, Howard. And for my email field, I put h@h.com. So then when I submit this form, I put in a request all the information that corresponds the name for the name input box and for the email input box. And this is how we actually grab information from a request and insert it to our database. So I want to say redirect to action index will fix this. So I'm just going to go back to new and then create user. It'll just redirect me to index. But I did receive the request to post users. Howard email is h@h.com. So in my create method, what I want to do is actually create my user. So I'm going to say @user equals user.new. And if you remember from before, you could pass in the param of attributes, and it will instantiate the user with those certain attributes. But how do I get those attributes? Those attributes are my params hash, but it's scoped under the key user. If you look back at the request, there's a key value pair that first, if you enter the key user, you get back a hash map back with the key values name and email. And this is the perfect format to pass into my new method to instantiate a new user. So if I do params user, after that, I'm going to do, then in theory, I should have a user whose name is whatever the name is on the form and whose email is the email on the form. if I at user.save, theoretically, this should insert into the database. And what I'm going to do after is render new. Okay, I'm going to go /new, create a user. I'm just going to put H, its email is A, okay, create user. Now I have an error. Why do I have an error? And it's okay if you don't know, because I only talked about it very slightly during my slides. And the thing is, when you make a request to Rails, Rails will force you to sanitize the request if you're going to make an insertion to your database. And when I mean sanitize the request, I mean like make sure that you're not entering attributes that Rails doesn't want you to enter. So for an example that I want to do is right now I have name, email, which are attributes. Those are the only attributes on my users, and I want whoever's signing up to always be able to access that, right? But let's say I had a different attribute called admin, and if admin is true, I have like power to look at everything in the website, and I don't want to give that to every user. But, and I'm just going to show you an example. Or I could easily just add an admin field. I could do Rails generate migration, add admin to users, pass in the name of the column, the type of the column, which is a Boolean, make db migrate. And I'll change it so that my console, if I do user.new, it now has the admin field, right? But if I pass in user.new and pass in the hash of name is, let's say this person's an attacker, email is A, and then normally in my form, I did not put an admin input on it, right? But if someone attempts to construct a request without using the form and just passing in data, what the person can do is add in a third attribute and say admin is true. And now to look at the last evaluation, I could just do, I'm missing a single quote, mismatched quotes. Okay. So now I have this user. I'm gonna store it in U just to show you. And you see right here that user.admin is now true. U.admin is true, which means that if I just let if I let anybody put in whatever data they want, they can actually mess up with my application and store themselves as an admin, which isn't what we want. We want to make sure that when we create our user, that it has the minimum amount of information that we want and that we allow them to update. Does that make sense? Do we have any questions about that so far? Okay, so now that we know there's a vulnerability, how do we, well, Rails prevents you, as you saw with the error, it actually prevents us from even having the vulnerability. It'll say there's a bug in your app until you fix it. So how do we fix it? We're gonna fix it like this. First, I'm gonna define a method. I'm gonna scope it under private so that it's a private method. You don't have to do this, it's just common practice, but I'm gonna find a method called user_params. So that anywhere in my controller, if I just were to type user_params, it would run the evaluation, it would run this function and return the last thing that was evaluated. So what I originally had that has all the input from the form is my params hash. So I first start with params. Params has a method called require that will say, make sure you have this key value pair and get me the evaluation of it. So I know that the attributes I want is scoped under a key called user. So I'm going to say require user. And right now, if I were to run this request, user params would return me the key value pairs name to whatever name I put in and email to whatever email I put in. And if some attacker were to insert another key value pair called admin true, they're allowed to do that right now. But there's a method called permit on this parameter hash. And what you do is pass it a bunch of symbols that you're saying allow these values to go through. So if I were to permit name and email, even though an attacker passes me in an admin true along with it, what this code will do is we'll have the params, will require users. It will have the admin true along with it, which is the attribute we don't want. But when we call .permit, we're saying only copy over the key value pairs of name and only copy over the key value pairs of email. So instead, I want my user.new to be passed in the evaluation of this function, user params. User underscore params. And instead of rendering new, I'm actually going to redirect back to action. Action. Oh, whoops. The action called index. So that means after I get my request, I filter out my parameters for only email and name from the user. And after I save it, I'm going to redirect to my index, which shows all the users. So I'm going to go back to my user/new. How do I create a new user? I'm going to say my user's name is Warren. The email is w@a.com. And when I hit create user, Warren's now shows up on my index. So effectively at this point, we have the ability to show information in our database. And now we have the ability to give any user a form to fill out, and they could actually update information on our database just through their web browser without, and we also have the ability to kind of force them to only input data that we want. So right now at Basis, we actually have a working application. If I could, with this information, I could actually just right now create a website that's like simply a form and for me an index that says, oh, critique me about this website. And anyone could, from around the world, as long as I push it up and have someone host the website, they could easily just fill out forms, and anyone around the world could fill out forms and anyone could read that information, which is really cool. We've actually done something, hopefully, that you find really significant. So yeah, do we have any questions about that so far? Yes.
They don't actually get why it didn't work earlier when you didn't have the user params function. Because when you didn't have admin, then it should have worked, right? Why didn't it work? When you just had user.new and you were.
Oh, okay. So the reason why it doesn't work is it's actually baked into the Ruby on Rails framework that you have to sanitize your parameters. Like the error I got there specifically was called the forbidden attributes error. And they only propagate that error if they know that you are just letting anybody update whatever you want. They're trying to force you, like, even though like if you create a web application with a different without a framework and just do it from scratch and you just write your own like HTTP request parser and stuff, like you don't need to like do that. You could just let users do whatever they want. But it's just a way that the people that whoever designed the software thought it would be safer to force everybody to be more secure about any web technology or any endpoint they write. Yeah.
Is it necessary to prepare user forms as well?
No, it's not necessary. I could take out private and it would still work. It's basically based off the idea, you know, in for those who have taken 61B, you have like public methods, private methods, and it's just to, even though you could technically make all your methods public and your program would still work, it's more for just telling other people when they're working with your program that other other controllers should not be calling this method. Yeah.
So other question, what is the render new? What is that?
Oh, render new. Okay. It's going to make more sense when I continue on with this lecture. But here is what render does. Render says, show me this view. That's literally it. It means after I run all the logic in my controller, instead of going to my create.html.erb, if I let it go to create.html.erb, my program would error out because I actually never made a create.html.erb. And the reason why I put render earlier was because what it would do is after I run all the logic, what I'm going to do is instead of going to my assumed view of create.html.erb, I want my application to go to new.html.erb. Yeah.
In that case, what's the difference between redirect to action index and render index?
Okay, that's a very good question. The difference between render and redirect is render only says show up this view, right? But what redirect to does is run the controller action. So basically, if here's a good example. So if I change this to, instead of redirect to index, and I'll just render index, when I run a create, I'm going to do @users, right? And @users.save. But since I'm calling render now instead of redirect, I'm never going to instantiate @users. And then the view that is associated with the index will have null for that instead. So just to kind of show it in action, and hopefully it doesn't do something different or I look like an idiot, I'm just going to fill this up with random information. I'm going to create this user, and I have an error. And that's because I'm calling each right here on @users, which is null. So I'm calling in each on null. And that's because instead of redirecting, which would run this @users equals users.all, I'm just saying, no, just give me this view with whatever instance variables I've defined within this controller action. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So, okay, there are two things left to show you. And one of them is validations. You remember before I was talking about within model files, you can actually write validations on your data to make sure your data is consistent. And why that's important is, whoops, I don't want to open Skype, is that I should probably fix my controller real quick. Render, instead of render index, I'll redirect _to my action of index. Okay, and I go here. I have these 4 users, right? But what if I start filling out? Sorry, excuse me. Okay, so what if I start creating empty users? Create. Whoops. Have a user/new, and I create empty and create a user without a name, but it has an email, and create user. Nothing shows up here, but when I go to my Rails console under user.count, I actually have 6 users instead of the 4 that shows up. And why is that? It is because I have users towards the end of my table that I just inserted, and if you look, that their name is just an empty string. And let's say I don't want people to start inserting empty rows in my database. It just takes up space. I'm paying money for it, so I mean, why? Well, I didn't really want to exit, but how do I prevent that from happening? And there's something called validations. So a basic validation that I want to show you is to validate the presence of a field. So to do a validation, I'll have to go to user model. And if you remember, that's an app models user.rb. And within this file, I've never defined anything until now. And what I'm going to do is define a validation. To define a validation, all I have to do is type in the word validates. Validates is a method that is defined within the active record base. So that this user class, which inherits from it, will be able to access this method validates. And what I'm going to pass it is a symbol. And that symbol is going to be a name of column I want to validate on. Right? So what I'm saying is validate something about the name column. And the basic validation I'm going to do for this lecture is presence. It's called presence, right? But I'm going to say presence true. True. And what this says is when I attempt to save a user, I'm going to validate its name and see if it is true. So in my Rails console, I'm going to see u equals user dot new. Right? I'm going to say u.save. And now I get back a false. Before, I always consistently got trues because I never had validations and my call to the database always succeeded in a successful query. This time, when I call save, I got a false. And that is because there are errors on my user. Let's see if I can actually look at it. And if you go in a model and call its .errors method, you'll get an error object, but the more important thing is to access its messages. So when you have an active record and you call .errors and call .messages, you'll get a list of all the validations that are failing on your model. And right now it's telling me, hey, your name column on your model cannot be blank because it's currently blank. So if I do u.name equals empty string, I do u.save, it'll be false because it doesn't count empty string as being present. And if I do it as a string with a few spaces, it'll still tell me false because it doesn't count that. Yes?
So when you're trying to like sign up for like an account on like some website and it requires you to have like a million different conditions for your password, like number, whatever, do they use like these validations to like error check, or do they actually just like have like so many short JavaScripts to check it for
I think it's both. Yeah. The thing is, you put JavaScript validations just to kind of like show like on your front end that that everything's a-okay. That or no, sorry, you put it on your front end to tell the user that wait, your password is not enough, and you put JavaScript validations there. But then you also want to put a validation on your server, because what if someone tries to make a request not from a browser, but like just from you can make an HTTP request with curl, I believe. There's a command on your Unix. There's a command in your terminal that you could just make HTTP requests, and instead, if I made a post request through this terminal towards the endpoint that the form normally hit, but instead provide a password that would not pass the JavaScript, and you didn't have protection on your backend, that it would just pass the JavaScript since you're not actually using the form, and it'll just go straight in the backend, and now you have like a not good password. Yeah. So it's always safe to just double up the protection. Yeah.
What if your database has already like its own validation procedures? Do you put the same validation procedures in your database?
Okay, so it depends what you're looking for. If you want to look just for this, so the question is, what if your database has its own validations? So right now, when I put these validations on Rails models, this validates on the Rails level. But databases without Rails applications can actually have their own validations about like having not null columns or basic stuff like that. And the question was like, why would I put a validation on my Rails model if I already have one in my database? And the real answer is it depends. But then I'm going to go with you should put it on both. And here's the reason why. With validations on your Rails models, you could put messages, and stuff like that that propagates up. Versus when you go, if you only have a database validation, you'll get back a false, and you'll have to kind of like read a SQL string, or just go into your database and look for your like null constraints on things and whatnot. Versus if you create a validation on Rails, it's much more easy for people that you work with. Like if you're a single person on an application, you know everything that's going on, or hopefully you remember everything's going on. But when you work with multiple people, if you have validations only on the database and they're trying to save a piece of data and they're not passing the validation, they might not even realize why it's failing. And so it's always safer to put the errors on the Rails like you should have it at the database level to protect your data, but you should have the validations on your Rails models to basically inform the people that you work with more easily, and it's more easily propagated up to a front end when like let's say your password's too short or something, then it can actually get propagated from it's much easier to propagate it from like the Ruby level up to your HTML rather than all the way from like a database. Does that answer? Okay. So yes, those are validations. So how do I prevent how do I prevent someone from signing up without a name? So this is what I can now do. Now that you see that if I don't have a name, my validates returns false. Or my .save turns false, right? So I can go to my user controller. And on my create, I've created a new user. I have not saved it yet. But let's say I do an if-else clause. If user.saves, basically if I pass all the validations on the user after I pass in the data from my form, if that actually successfully saves, I'm going to redirect to my index. But in my else case, if my validation fails, what I'm going to do is just render new. I'm going to call end. Okay, and now let's just observe this behavior. I'm going to go to my user/new. So let's say I have a totally valid user. Create user, have that new valid user at the end. But if I have a user without a name and just an email, I hit create user, get my form back. And the reason is it goes through this logic, goes to user equals @user. And since it doesn't have a name, when I call @user.save, it's going to return false. So instead of redirecting back to the index, what I'll do is render the new. And if you remember from earlier when I answered the question, what's the difference between render and redirect, is that redirect calls the function, calls the controller action all over, but render just says use whatever instance variables I've created in this action and propagate me, just use the view. And I said use the view of new. Now here's an interesting thing I want you to know. My email is still there. Even though I redirected, my email is still there. And why is that? It's because when I go through, when I submit the form and go to the create, I make @user an instance of user. And within that instance of user, I've said, hey, the email is like whatever I put in the form, right? The magic about form 4 is that if there's an attribute on this that's pre-populated, for this one, @user actually got assigned an email. When I create a text field email, it'll just pre-populate that form for me. It's really nice. So just as an interesting experiment, like let's say if I just went to the new, and I said name equals hi. I believe this will work at least. That if I just go to /new and just restart to my new action, I pre-populate the form already. And that's why the form for method is really useful. It could basically pre-populate fields for you and guess routes for you. What are your questions about that? Yeah. Yes. So yes, that is validations, and that's what happens. That's how you can prevent people from doing dummy entries into your database. Yes.
How does a form check whether your email is valid? Like on some forms, you put in your email and press enter, and it's like that's not valid. You know what happens with that?
Yes. So I know what happened. I don't know the exact code I have to write off the top of my head, but basically, do you know what a regular expression is, regex? So I think it's a topic covered in 61B. But basically, what happens is that when you have like, for in Rails, you would do something called like validates, like email. You want to make sure your presence is true. You pass in another option that's like format, I believe. Because I'm just guessing off the top of my head based off like memory of doing this like a while back. And you can just pass in a regular expression right here. And you just type in the regular expression of the email, which is like minimum number of characters, then like up to any number of characters, then an @ sign, then at least one character, then at least a dot, and at least one character plus after that. And that's how they actually do it. They check for the regular expression. Okay. So I have one last small thing to show you, and it's basically show. What show is in general in a Rails application, it's basically a way to get detailed information about a user. So within my users, I only show the name, but let's say when I go to a particular user and view particular information about that user, I want to get their email too. How do I do that? Get a special view for it. So that's what show is. So I go to my controller, and what I'm going to do is make a method called show, or define show. I'm going to create a view for it, which is show.html.erb, and say h1 show, close it. And what I'm going to do right now is within my users controller, say if I get users /:ID, what I'm going to do is map it to users #show. Okay. What is :ID? :ID is basically when you define a route and you have a colon in front of, like if you get a slash and you put a colon after it, this is more like kind of like a wild card that if anything that gets past, if you must have a route that's user / and anything past it, what Rails will do is in your parameters, we will go to my users show method, and in my parameters, I'll have an ID key, and the value of the ID key is whatever shows up here. So just for the sake of example, I'm going to put an H2 right here, and it's going to be a piece of embedded Ruby. And I'm going to call that piece of Ruby ID. And I'm going to say that within my params, I have an ID. So that @ID will show up. And I have a closing H2 tag. Okay. So now if I go to user/1, I'll print out my show. I've assigned @ID to whatever my params ID is, and I'll put it in H2. So I could just pretty much manipulate the number there, because the value after users is passed on to my params. I'm accessing that to edit my HTML. Do you have any questions about that so far? We good. Okay, so how do I find a particular user? If you remember, users actually all have a unique identifier on them, and it's their ID. So if I want to get a particular user, let's say I would just give our Rails application to find that user by a particular ID. What I would do is say, in my show method, I'm going to get an ID from params ID. And if you remember to query a user by their ID, all you need to do is call .find. So when I call user.find params ID, whatever ID I pass it, I'm going to try to find that user, and I'm going to assign it to the @user variable. Now, in my show, I have access to that @user variable. So within my HTML, I could just put in specific information about the user by just accessing @user. I put the user's name here, and I could just put the @user.email right here, and I could just put in email. And now go to user/1. And now I got my first, I have an extra greater than sign somewhere. Oh, right there. Okay. But in my show view, I matched a wildcard :ID in my routes. Basically, within my parameters, that :ID is 1. So I'm going to attempt to find the user with ID 1. And in this view, I'm going to print out the user's name and then print out the user's email. And that's how you have a show. That is a show page. Now, it's kind of tedious to get to find users or find emails by just doing the URLs. Let's say I just want to click on a user right here, and it'll go through my detailed view of them. So the way to do that is something we actually learned from the second lecture. It was a method called, I believe it was linked to. That create a p tag, right? And instead, I'm going to actually create a link to _2. And then the first argument of link to, if you remember, is just the string on the link. And I'm going to make it the same and just be the user's name. And second, I'm going to pass in the URL. But if I put a static URL in here, I'll go to a particular user every time. Like if I put in like the string like /users/1, every single user I propagate on this index will go to my first user, which is Howard. But I want it to be able to go to any user. And this is where our routes come in again. So if I look at my rake routes, which basically, if you remember, is a list of all our URL prefixes, so that I actually have I can access users _path, and I would get a link to the user's index. If I did users _new, I'd get a link to users new, but instead I want to get a show. And also that was mentioned in the second lecture is our ability to define a prefix ourselves. So let's say I don't like users/ID or I just want to define my own route. Let's say it's user. Then I get a prefix user. So I could actually access this URL based off, just calling user _path. And just to show you the versatility of this, if I just want to give a terrible name like A, and I hate my coworkers or something, I could access it through A _path. But I'm just going to go back to users since that makes the most sense. And now, here's what we can do. My link to, which is my index, instead of making a static string, I can calculate the string every time for the URL by doing user path and passing it the user. So, okay, I refresh, right? Now all the names turn into links. And if I click on this one, it'll go give me user 1. And if I click on this one, it'll give me user 2. If I click on this one, it'll give me user 4. This one, user 7. And if you remember that we have 2 users in our database that have no names, and that's why it skips a few numbers. But yes. So the reason why we have these like underscore path things is to actually dynamically generate these URLs. Because if I didn't have that, what I would have to do is do some weird like a way that would be just straight up wrong, like wouldn't work, would be /user/1, or I would have to do some weird math that would be like plus like user.id, which is kind of ugly. And then the minute I change my route, for example, of this to users A or something, then I would have to look through all my code and change this hard-coded string. But since I have users underscore path, and whatever I name this to will always be referred to as the user underscore path, it allows me to make changes without like affecting like 50 other files. And that's the usefulness of paths and routes. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Let me go back to the terminology with the wait routes.
Yes.
So you define the prefix of
Sorry.
the show action as user.
Yeah.
And then Rails automatically do users underscore path
Yes.
to indicate what? Indicate it's like this part, I don't know, like how can it be like so smart to know exactly
Yes.
what you want that?
That is a great question. How can it be so smart?
Wait, exactly.
Yes. No, it's, wait, sorry. I'm getting a little excited because this, what it's doing right now is actually really amazing, that it could get a string and then somehow shove it into a variable for you to access in your views. It's actually really crazy. I don't know exactly how they do it. I can only tell you, this is like part of the reason why people really like Rails. It's just that these methods that they provide you are really convenient for the reasons I said. Like if you were to do a hard-coded string like plus a certain thing, that if you were to change that route's at like endpoint from users to like /a/users, then you have to go and change in like 50 files. But if you just have a prefix that's always like the middleman between it, then even if you change that route, the rest of your code still works. It like my best guess of how they do it is basically they just basically they try to make routes out of this. Like the first thing you pass it, right, as prefixes, and if you have slashes, they'll turn it to underscores. But this one, I manually when you get an option of an as, it'll just manually override it. So I just created the users prefixes, and how they create the variable is for every prefix they have, they'll just iterate through add an underscore, add a path, and then you could, and right now they have a string, right? But in Ruby, you could actually give objects a string. You could pretty much give objects a string and an anonymous function, and then it becomes like accessible as a function within an instance of a class. And this instance would be kind of like whatever populates the view. That's my best guess of how they do it. Actual details, I don't know too much. Yes.
Another question I have is, how can you, is there a way to like do wildcards, for example, one for ID and like another one for name?
So you mean like this?
Not really. What I meant is like, for example, if we type user/1, it takes us to like the first user.
Mhm.
If we type user/Howard, then it takes us to like Howard again. Is that possible?
Yes, that is totally possible. I have a way to do it off the top of my head. I know it's the best way. I think my best guess, I'm just throwing an idea out here, is that we just shove in either an ID or a name, and the controller will attempt to parse the int if it's okay. Perfect. Okay. So a way you can do it is, it requires a lot more logic in your controller instead of .find, right? So when you get this ID back, you're saying you have the possibility of either an ID or a string. I'm just going to kind of write some pseudocode right here. In our show, our premise ID will return us a string. It's either an integer or someone's name, right? I could attempt to, let's see. A possible way to do it is attempt to parse the int. And if it fails, then I know it's a name. And so it would be an if-else clause, right? If I parse it to an int and it succeeds, I'll just call my user.find by ID. But if it's a name, If I find out params ID is a name, I could just instead in my else clause set at user equal to user dot find by name, and then pass it the params ID. And then now you have the ability to find either by an ID number or by someone's username. And another way you could do it is actually create multiple controllers. So you have one way to find it by ID, and you can also create a separate set of routes to find it by name. So yes. Any questions? All right, that is my lecture. Hopefully at this point, now you actually know how to create a form, validate stuff on the form, and when you when people on the internet insert things on the form, that everyone has access to that information. You'll pretty much be doing this exact same thing over on the homework. So the goal of this homework is to be just to kind of like just retrace the steps. And if you get if you're in a like dire need of help, you could reference the code that's already in there. But my best advice for you to do is actually when I'm assuming you won't do this homework immediately, but in a few days, right before you start, just look quickly through the annotated code I provide you, digest it, and then try to do the whole thing without looking back to the annotated code, but instead doing what you remember. And when you get stuck, just looking at Rails tutorials. I think that would be the best way to kind of absorb it. But yes, the annotated code is there in case you need help, because we're getting to the point where we're trying to touch 5 different places in the app at once. Yeah, so I'm gonna put in the chicken code up real quick. So yeah, just sit tight. I don't know, talk to each other. Yeah. Are you gonna use your computer?
Nah, I use yours.
Can you possibly use yours, or do you think?
Yeah, as long as it connects.
Okay. Check that.
It took all the time though, dude.
Oh, it's 20 minutes since you click up.
I literally made the fucking sickest website ever.
You can just do it in 2 parts.
I can't even finish it yet.
Sorry.
That wasn't. You guys weren't just. Ah man.